The room was still when it happened, so still that every breath felt borrowed from the same air. Then came Posner's voice, sharp, deliberate, carrying just enough venom to slice through the polished silence. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "Crockett," he said, leaning forward with a smirk, "is nothing more than a fake lawyer." The words seemed to fall in slow motion, like shards of glass shattering across the floor. At first, no one moved. A single cough in the gallery broke the vacuum, and then, like a ripple cutting across water, faces began to shift. Brows lifted in disbelief. Eyes widened. Whispers snaked from one row to the next. The air thickened with the soundless gasp of a crowd that could not believe what it had just heard. Crockett did not flinch. That was the most infuriating thing for Posner. His target stood there, unshaken, his jaw set, his eyes steady. The insult was meant to humiliate, to strip him of legitimacy before the first argument could even unfold. Yet Crockett's stillness only amplified the insult, magnifying it, forcing every ear in the room to replay those poisonous syllables. Fake lawyer. It was not just an attack. It was a dagger thrown in front of an audience trained to believe in the sanctity of the courtroom. A challenge. A spectacle. An attempt to brand a man with a scarlet letter he hadn't earned. The judge's gavel tapped once, but even that sound felt powerless against the charge in the air. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked like thunder, and somewhere in the back row, someone muttered under their breath, "Did he really just say that?" Every immigrant in that room, every working parent, every dreamer who had clawed their way into legitimacy felt the insult burn through them too, because this wasn't only about Crockett. This was about the audacity of a man in power declaring who was real and who was not, who belonged and who didn't. Posner's smile widened, certain he had seized the upper hand. But the silence that followed was not submission. It was pressure building, an unspoken promise that something was about to erupt. And in that moment, as the room held its breath, no one could predict how quickly the tables were about to turn. But what came next would flip the entire courtroom dynamic on its head. For a heartbeat, the insult seemed aimed at only one person. But Crockett knew, every person in that courtroom knew, that the moment was larger than her. When Posner spat those words, "fake lawyer," he wasn't just attacking her credentials. He was dragging the weight of centuries into the room. He was summoning every shadow of doubt cast on women who fought to be seen, every whisper that questioned a black professional's place at the table, every smirk that reduced excellence to tokenism. Crockett stood beneath the weight of that history, and she did not bend. She had fought too hard to stand in that courtroom, not as a symbol, but as a lawyer, earned, tested, proven. And yet in Posner's sneer, all of it was dismissed in an instant, as if her journey were nothing but a costume worn for show. The audience wasn't just shocked. They were polarized. Some shifted uncomfortably, ashamed to see arrogance laid so bare. Others leaned forward, drinking in the spectacle, eager for the drama of a public unraveling. But in every corner, cameras recorded, beams of red light blinking like watchful eyes. What Posner may have believed was a dagger meant for Crockett alone had, in an instant, become a national moment. Because as those cameras rolled, the insult was no longer personal. It became collective. Every young black woman studying late into the night, every first-generation immigrant pushing past prejudice, every child told they did not belong. This was their moment, too. Crockett was standing where so many of them could not, carrying the insult like a public brand. And the question, now hanging in the air, was whether she would crumble beneath it or transform it into fire. Posner's arrogance dripped with entitlement. He embodied the voice that assumes power is inherited, that legitimacy is stamped by legacy, that the courtroom itself was a stage and others were merely guests. He had never felt the exhaustion of proving himself twice over just to be treated as equal once. He had never felt the sting of being mistaken for less before being acknowledged as capable. He had never understood the lived struggle of those who build their credibility brick by brick, only to have it questioned with a single sneer. That was a duel unfolding in silence. Arrogance versus struggle. One man's smirk against generations of fight. And though the courtroom air was thick with the sound of gasps and murmurs, there was something deeper pulsing beneath it. The awareness that this was no ordinary clash. This was a fault line running through the country itself. For Crockett, The insult wasn't surprise. It was the inevitability of her existence in spaces that were never built for her. But inevitability does not make the cut any less sharp. Her resolve, however, was not forged in comfort. It was shaped in fire. And as she raised her chin slightly, refusing to break eye contact, the room could feel the electricity shift. The insult had landed, but it had not won. And in homes across America, viewers would replay that moment and whisper to themselves, "If she can hold steady here, maybe I can too." That was the power Posner had unknowingly unleashed. He had turned a courtroom exchange into a referendum on belonging, legitimacy, and the American promise itself. But to understand why this moment exploded, we need to see the man behind the insult. Richard Posner had always been a kind of figure who drew both awe and irritation. His intellect was undeniable, razor-sharp, methodical, the sort of mind that could parse a statute faster than most could read its title. Colleagues often spoke of his brilliance with a reverence usually reserved for legends. He published articles that shaped the way law schools taught their students, dismantled arguments with surgical precision, and cultivated an aura of invincibility in the courtroom. On paper, he was a man built for admiration. But brilliance was only half the story. The other half was arrogance, a steady drumbeat that followed him wherever he went. For every accolade, there was a trail of dismissive remarks. For every lecture that dazzled with clarity, there was a smirk that told listeners he believed himself leagues above them. Posner did not simply argue. He belittled. He had a way of making even seasoned attorneys feel like children fumbling through their first moot court. And though some found his bluntness refreshing, many more saw it for what it was. Contempt dressed as confidence. His history was peppered with these moments. In debates, he often brushed aside opposing views not with counterpoints, but with ridicule. When asked about the struggles of young lawyers trying to find footing in a system stacked against them, he would quip about merit rising to the top as though systemic barriers were fairy tales. When questioned about the role of diversity in the legal profession, he offered half smiles and evasions, never outright hostile, but dripping with the suggestion that the conversation itself was beneath him. This was the paradox of Richard Posner, a man who championed the law as the highest discipline, yet consistently belittled those who embodied its progress. He spoke of justice, but rarely recognized the human stories behind it. He exalted the ideals of reason and logic, yet dismissed lived experience as anecdotal noise. In his worldview, legitimacy came from intellect alone, measured, of course, by his own yardstick. That elitism had become a shield. He wore it like armor, deflecting any criticism with the assertion that his brilliance excused his abrasiveness. To those who worshipped intellectual purity, he was a hero. To those who lived on the margins, clawing for recognition, he was a gatekeeper dressed in robes of superiority. And therein lay the heart of the contradiction. Posner saw himself as a defender of the law's sanctity, yet his actions often undermined its most sacred principle, that the law belonged to everyone, not just to those who looked like him, thought like him, or came from the circles he deemed worthy. By drawing such sharp lines of legitimacy, he inadvertently revealed his own fragility. He needed to belittle others to maintain his pedestal, because without the shadow of inferiors, his own brilliance might not shine so brightly. It was not the first time he had labeled someone fake. Over the years, whispers of his disdain circulated in corridors and conferences. Young attorneys, especially women and people of color, knew the chill of his judgment before they ever stepped into his courtroom. A raised eyebrow here, a muttered aside there, subtle signals that their presence was tolerated, not respected. Each moment alone might have seemed trivial, but together they formed a pattern, one of dismissal, exclusion, and quiet erosion of dignity. And yet, to many, Posner was still untouchable. He carried himself with the confidence of a man certain that institutions bent in his favor. He was a Goliath of the courtroom, larger than life, armored in reputation, swinging words like stones that shattered reputations. He believed his sharp tongue and sharper mind would always carry the day. But therein lies the flaw of Goliath figures. Arrogance blinds. Posner never considered that the very traits he wielded as weapons could someday become the cracks in his own armor. He believed intellect insulated him from accountability. He believed the world would always interpret his contempt as candor. He believed no one could turn his own tactics against him. That belief would soon be tested, for when he dismissed Crockett as a fake lawyer, he thought he was repeating an old trick, one more sneer in a lifetime of them. What he did not realize was that this time, the cameras were rolling, the stakes were higher, and the audience was no longer content to nod along with elitism disguised as brilliance. In the spotlight of a national stage, Richard Posner's contradictions could no longer hide in the margins of transcripts or the footnotes of opinions. They were laid bare, exposed not only to those in the courtroom, but to millions watching beyond its walls. And for the first time, his smirk looked less like confidence and more like desperation waiting to be revealed. Yet while Posner built walls of arrogance, Crockett was building something else entirely. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in marble hallways or ivy-clad campuses. It began in the grit of modest neighborhoods, where the sound of ambition often competed with the noise of survival. She grew up watching her family work harder than most, only to receive less than what was fair. Bills paid late, dreams deferred, dignity bargained for in long shifts and double shifts. This was the backdrop of her childhood. But rather than crush her spirit, it planted something else inside her. A defiance, a refusal to accept that injustice was a natural order of the world. From an early age, she understood that resilience was not optional. It was survival. Teachers noticed how she lingered after class, her notebooks filled with questions that reached beyond the curriculum. While others saw limits, she saw loopholes. While others accepted the rules as written, she wondered who wrote them and why. Law was not a career path whispered to her. It was something she claimed for herself, piece by piece, like an inheritance she would have to fight to prove belonged to her. But ambition without sacrifice is a dream, and Crockett's journey demanded sacrifice. She worked jobs that barely covered tuition, nights where sleep was stolen in fragments between study sessions, and shifts that kept her on her feet until her legs ached. There were times when the bills seemed impossible, when the temptation to step back loomed large. Yet every obstacle only sharpened her resolve. She carried the weight of not just her own future, but the expectations of those who had paved the way before her, those who had less but still dared to believe in her. Law school tested her in ways no syllabus could capture. In classrooms, she was often one of the few faces that looked like hers. The assumptions came subtly at first, then more directly. Professors surprised at her sharp insights, peers questioning whether her seat was earned or given. She learned quickly that brilliance alone wasn't enough. She had to prove it over and over, every time she opened her mouth, every time she turned in a brief. And so she did. Each recitation, each exam, each mock trial became another notch in her armor. By the time she graduated, she was not just a lawyer. She was a fighter honed by fire. Her early years in practice brought her face to face with the people the system often forgot. She represented clients who had no voice, no resources, no hope beyond her determination. The courtroom became her battleground, and it was there that she found her true rhythm. She argued not with arrogance but with conviction, weaving facts into stories, showing judges and juries the humanity behind every case file. There were losses, of course, brutal ones that stung in the quiet of the night. But each defeat became a lesson, each closed door a reminder that progress often comes at the pace of persistence. And then there were victories, the kind that transform lives. A mother reunited with her children after years of separation, a wrongfully accused teenager walking free, a worker finally receiving the wages stolen from him. These moments mattered. They were proof that her license was not just a certificate on the wall, but a tool wielded with purpose. Through it all, Crockett carried herself with a quiet ferocity. She did not need to announce her legitimacy, because she lived it daily. She knew the sting of prejudice, the exhaustion of constant doubt, the burden of representing more than just herself. But she also knew the power of resilience. Her journey was not one of shortcuts or privilege. It was carved in sacrifice, persistence, and triumph earned through grit. As her reputation grew, so did the whispers of respect. Colleagues began to take note of her sharp strategies, her ability to stay composed under pressure, her relentless advocacy. Opponents learned quickly that underestimating her was a mistake. She was not simply present in the courtroom. She owned her space, commanding it with a blend of grace and steel. And yet, Even with victory stacking behind her, the skepticism never fully disappeared. There were always voices ready to question, to belittle, to remind her that legitimacy for someone like her was always provisional in their eyes. But Crockett did not let those voices define her. She let her record speak louder. Her victories echo further. Each case won, each client defended, was a rebuttal to the cynicism that followed her. These victories would soon silence even the loudest voices of doubt, because Jasmine Crockett was not simply a lawyer on paper. She was battle-tested, forged by struggle, tempered by sacrifice, proven in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her. She carried the weight of her community, the hopes of those who had been dismissed, and the fire of someone who knew that legitimacy wasn't handed down. It was seized. And when the two worlds finally collided, the atmosphere was electric. The courtroom was already tense, but Posner wasn't finished. He leaned forward, voice dripping with scorn, pressing his advantage as though Crockett's silence was weakness rather than discipline. "You can dress it up however you like," he said, his tone sharp enough to slice through the room. "But credentials on paper don't make someone the real thing. A law degree, a license, those are props. And you, Ms. Crockett, are putting on a performance." The words hit like a hammer. Gasps rose from the gallery. Reporters' pens flew across notebooks. Cameras snapped a frenzy, capturing the smirk widening across Posner's face. He could feel the eyes of the audience on him, and he fed on it. This was a theater he lived for, and he believed he was scripting Crockett's collapse. Crockett did not collapse. She sat straighter, her hands clasped together on the table, eyes locked on Posner with a focus that unnerved even those rooting for him. Her face betrayed none of the insult's sting, but her stillness radiated a heat that was undeniable. She wasn't breaking. She was coiling. Posner mistook it for passivity. He pushed harder. "Tell me, Ms. Crockett," he continued, gesturing broadly so that even the back row could feel the weight of his condescension. "What real case have you argued that wasn't handed to you? What victory have you earned without leaning on your story, without playing the part of the victim to gain sympathy?" The insult cut deeper now, not just at Crockett, but at the countless people whose struggles she represented. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Some muttered in anger, others in disbelief. A woman in the gallery shook her head slowly, as if to ask, "Is he really saying this?" Crockett's composure, however, became its own performance, one of discipline, restraint, and dignity. She did not rush to fill the silence he created. She allowed it to expand, to let the weight of his words hang heavy in the air. Every second of her quiet was a contrast to his needling arrogance. The imbalance was striking. One figure brash and unrestrained, the other calm, contained, her silence speaking louder than his volume. Still, Posner thrived on provocation. He narrowed his eyes and raised his voice, sensing that if he only pushed harder, she would snap. "The truth, Miss Crockett," he declared, "is that you were the title of lawyer, but you lack the substance. You're a facade, an image constructed for applause, not respect." The room erupted in gasps this time, louder, sharper, as if the audience itself could no longer believe the brazenness of his attack. A line had been crossed, and everyone knew it. Even the judge shifted uncomfortably, gavel in hand but reluctant to break the unfolding spectacle. And still, Crockett did not flinch. Her eyes never left Posner, her expression steady, her posture unbroken. Yet beneath that composure, something unmistakable flickered. Fire. Not anger that consumed, but anger that clarified, that refined, that prepared itself for precision. The audience felt it too. The murmurs shifted. Some whispered in awe, others in anticipation. Something was building. Crockett's stillness was no longer misread as fragility. It was recognized as control. The calm before a storm. Posner, blind to the shifting tide, pressed on. "Do you know what this country needs?" he asked, his tone swelling with self-righteousness. "It needs real lawyers, not actors pretending to be defenders of the law. And frankly, Jasmine Crockett, you fooled these people long enough." The gallery's reaction was immediate, an audible mix of outrage and suspense, as though the very air had been split in two. Some shook their heads, disgusted. Others leaned forward, hungry to see how she would answer. The line between villain and hero had been drawn clearly now, and the room was waiting for the inevitable clash. Crockett drew a breath. Not shallow, not hurried, but deep and deliberate. The kind of breath that signals patience giving way to power. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes sharp as steel. The silence stretched for one heartbeat, then another, until the anticipation itself became unbearable. And then, with the nation watching, Jasmine Crockett delivered a counterattack no one saw coming. Crockett leaned forward at last, her voice steady, calm, and deliberate. The kind of calm that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, because it carried the weight of certainty. She didn't match Posner's volume. She didn't need to. Her words cut sharper in quiet than his had in fury. "You want to talk about performance, Judge?" she began, her eyes never leaving him. "Let's talk about proof." The room fell still. Her first point landed like a carefully aimed arrow. When a mother in Dallas was wrongfully stripped of her children, it was me who fought her case. I stood in front of a jury that doubted her, that doubted me. And I didn't walk out until she walked out with her kids back in her arms. A murmur swept through the gallery, half gasp, half hum of approval. Posner shifted slightly in his seat. And when a young black teenager was accused of crime he didn't commit, with no money, no voice, and no one willing to believe his innocence, it was me who stayed up night after night, combing through evidence the state had overlooked. And when the gavel finally struck, it wasn't an image that walked free. It was a boy with his life back. The crowd's murmur grew louder now. And for the first time, cameras flashed not at Posner, but at her. She paused. Let the silence do its work. "My record is not a facade," she continued, voice firm but still even. "It's a body of work. Case after case. Client after client. Lives change because I did the job you accused me of faking." Gasps turned into applause, scattered at first, then swelling, before the judge's gavel struck to call for order. The crowd quieted, but the energy had shifted completely. Crockett pressed on, her cadence measured like a drumbeat building to a crescendo. "Do you remember the case of the factory workers in Houston?" she asked, tilting her head just slightly, her eyes fixed on Posner's narrowing gaze. "The ones cheated out of months of wages, told they had no legal recourse? I represented them when no one else would, and those workers walked out of that courtroom with not only their wages, but their dignity. That wasn't sympathy. That wasn't performance. That was justice." A low hum of approval rolled through the room. Reporters were scribbling furiously, others abandoning their pens to tap madly at phones, sending updates flying onto Twitter. Crockett's firing back, point by point. Posner looks rattled. For the first time, Posner's smirk faltered. "And you dare call me a fake?" Crockett's voice rose, not in anger, but in conviction. "You, who have made a career out of dismissing the very people law is meant to serve, sit there in judgment of whether I belong? My belonging has never been defined by your permission. It's been carved out of struggle, sacrifice, and results." The audience erupted in applause again, this time louder, bolder, unstoppable until the gavel cracked the air like thunder. Even then, a ripple of claps lingered, stubborn as the truth itself. Crockett didn't rush. She let the energy hang, then tightened her grip on the moment. "Judge Posner," she said, lowering her voice again, forcing the room to lean in. "Your brilliance is real. No one questions that. But brilliance without humility is just arrogance. And arrogance without results is emptiness. I stand here not as a symbol, not as a victim, but as proof. Proof that the law belongs to more than the few who claim it as inheritance. Proof that legitimacy is not granted by pedigree. It's earned by service." Crockett pressed further, each example a nail in the coffin of his accusation. "I have argued cases that restored livelihoods, defended the powerless, and upheld the dignity of people this system routinely tries to forget. And every victory I've won has been documented, certified, recorded in the very books you claim I don't deserve to touch. Those aren't performances. Those are receipts." The room erupted again. Gasps, applause, cheers muffled by the judge's gavel, but unstoppable nonetheless. "And here's the truth," she said, her voice carrying above the noise. "I didn't come here today to prove myself to you. I came here to do what I've always done, fight for justice. But since you've chosen to make this about legitimacy, then let's be clear. My legitimacy is not up for debate. My work speaks for itself. My clients' lives speak for themselves. And if you, Judge Posner, can't see that, then perhaps the problem is not that I am fake. Perhaps the problem is that you are afraid. Afraid of a world where people like me don't need your permission to belong. The courtroom gasped as though struck by lightning. Posner blinked, his lips parting for a retort that never came. Reporters were already sending out headlines. Crockett dismantles Posner in real time. Twitter trended with clips of her words, each one captioned with fire emojis, each one replayed with awe. Crockett leaned back, her expression calm once again, as if she had merely stated facts too obvious to deny. The crowd's energy swelled around her, no longer split but aligned, unified in recognition of what had just unfolded. And in that moment, it was Posner who looked small, his smirk gone, his eyes darting, his once commanding presence reduced to a figure weighed down by his own arrogance. Crockett hadn't shouted. She hadn't raged. She had simply presented the truth, layered proof upon proof, until a mountain of evidence towered so high that even he could not see past it. The final blow came with her closing words, delivered softly but carrying the weight of thunder. So if I am fake, Judge, then let every client I've defended, every victory I've earned, every injustice I've overturned stand as counterfeit too. But if they are real, and they are, then so am I. The room broke into applause, no longer containable, no longer polite. It was thunderous, defiant, a collective declaration that the accusation had not only failed but backfired. And as the gavel pounded for order, the cameras captured what would become the defining image. Posner slumped back, shaken, while Crockett sat tall, radiant in quiet triumph. But Crockett's words didn't just stop at the courtroom. They ignited something much larger. The courtroom fell back into silence, but outside those walls the noise was deafening. Within minutes of Crockett's counterattack, social media had erupted into a storm. Twitter lit up with hashtags that climbed to the top of the trending list before the gavel even struck for adjournment. Hashtag Crockett versus Posner, hashtag receipts in court, hashtag fake no more. Clips of her calm dismantling spread like wildfire, chopped into 30-second segments replayed on loop. Each pause, each revelation dissected and celebrated. Memes bloomed across the internet in real time. Screenshot of Posner's faltering smirk captioned with lines like, "When you realize the receipts are real." Split-screen edits compared his arrogance with her composure. Goliath shrinking as David stood tall. TikTok creators remixed her words into beats, set against flashes of cheering crowds and courtroom stills. By nightfall, her takedown wasn't just news. It was culture. Headlines followed quickly. New York Times, Crockett turns insult into national moment. Washington Post, from fake to formidable, how one lawyer redefined legitimacy in real time. On cable news, anchors replayed the exchange, some marveling at her restraint. Others calling it one of the most decisive rebuttals ever caught on camera. Meanwhile, Posner's silence told its own story. Reporters lingered near him as he exited the building. Microphones extended. Questions shouted. But the words that once flowed so freely had dried up. He gave no statements, no dismissive quips. His face, once framed by smug certainty, was now shadowed by something rare for him: defeat. Comment sections across platforms echoed with validation. Strangers quoted Crockett's words back to one another as if they were scripture. "My belonging has never been defined by your permission" became the rallying cry of the day, painted onto digital banners, reposted with fire emojis, claimed by thousands as personal truth. On Facebook, supporters wrote long posts tying her story to their own. First-generation students, immigrants, women of color and professions where doubt trailed them at every step. They saw themselves in her, and they celebrated her victory as their own. Celebrities chimed in, amplifying the moment beyond the political and legal world. Actors, athletes, musicians retweeted the clips, adding their voices. A famous singer posted, "This is what power looks like when it's earned, not inherited." A professional athlete wrote, "Crockett just schooled every doubter in America. Respect." The validation snowballed, each high-profile endorsement pushing her further into the spotlight. For every cheer, there were critics too, those who tried to downplay the moment, dismissing it as theatrics. But their voices were drowned out, buried under a tidal wave of support. For once, the narrative wasn't written by the usual gatekeepers. It was shaped by the people, replayed on their screens, captioned in their words, carried on their platforms. The transformation was undeniable. Just hours before, Crockett had been branded fake in a public forum. By the end of the day, she was a symbol of resilience, of legitimacy earned in the trenches, of dignity unshaken by arrogance. She wasn't just offended. She was celebrated. And the speed with which that celebration spread spoke to a deeper hunger. People wanted her win. They needed her win, because in silencing Posner's sneer, she had silenced every echo of doubt they'd endured themselves. Meanwhile, Posner's name trended too, but for all the wrong reasons. Memes mocked his downfall, commentators critiqued his elitism, and late-night hosts teased that his ego had taken a beating no closing argument could repair. The man who once thrived on attention now recoiled from it, his silence magnifying his loss. Where Crockett's words grew louder with every share, his absence of words became its own humiliation. The energy spilled beyond screens. In coffee shops and classrooms, people repeated her lines. In community centers and workplaces, her composure was dissected as a masterclass in holding ground. Teachers played clips for students as examples of courage under fire. Activists quoted her in speeches. She had become more than a lawyer defending herself. She was a mirror reflecting the struggles and victories of millions. The cultural shift was complete when even her opponents grudgingly acknowledged her strength. One pundit, visibly reluctant, admitted on live television, "You can disagree with her politics all you want, but that was a textbook takedown. She earned her moment." And so, a single insult meant to reduce her had been flipped, amplified, and transformed into a national declaration. Crockett had not just survived the attack. She had converted it into fuel. From insult to icon in a matter of hours, she stood not as a victim of Posner's arrogance, but as the victor over it. And in the end, this wasn't just about Crockett versus Posner. It was about something much bigger. It began with an insult meant to humiliate, meant to strip legitimacy from a woman who had earned every inch of her place. But instead of shattering her, those words became the spark that lit a fire. In the span of a single exchange, Richard Posner's arrogance collapsed into silence, and Jasmine Crockett's dignity roared louder than any insult could ever hope to. That is a power of resilience. That is a power of truth spoken with calm conviction. Crockett didn't meet arrogance with arrogance. She met it with proof, with lived victories, with a strength that came not from pedigree but from persistence. In doing so, she transformed a moment of dismissal into a moment of national validation. This is not just her story. It is a reminder of what's possible for all who have ever been told they don't belong. It's a testament that no sneer, no insult, no gatekeeper can erase the worth that has been carved through struggle and triumph. So here's the choice before us. Do we let arrogance define the narrative, or do we lift up the voices that prove dignity always outlasts contempt? If you believe that respect must never be conditional, if you believe that legitimacy is earned in action, not granted by entitlement, then share this story. Subscribe, amplify, and stand with voices like Jasmine Crockett's. Because every time arrogance tries to dismiss resilience, it's up to us to make sure the truth is louder. Jasmine Crockett turned an insult into silence, and in that silence, dignity spoke, and the nation listened.